Hey everybody, welcome to the third and final lecture of Module 1. I'm doing this lecture in a slightly more casual environment, partly out of convenience and partly to introduce a point that I want to make in this lecture about selection mechanisms and their connection with governance. I'm your professor in this class, and I'm sitting here in my home office doing this lecture because I've chosen to do it this way. I'm an office holder with a relatively high level of discretionary power, and how did I get to be in this particular position? And what did that selection mechanism have to do with the kind of thing that's happening right now, the kind of decisions I make, the kind of person that I am? This is an example of how selection mechanisms connect with governance, even though it's probably not what you were thinking or talking about, and I will get to sort of more official politics discussion after I run through this initial example. But I am an office holder who has a certain level of discretionary power. I have responsibilities, there are limitations, I am embedded in an institution with checks and balances and other people, and I was selected through a hiring process, not a civil service process like governments have for bureaucrats and other types of non-appointee and non-elected office holders, but through a hiring process that in many ways has similar features to a civil service process because it's governed by regulations. While it's conducted by people, it's conducted by specific people who themselves have a specific position, and they have a certain level of discretion but also responsibility and limits on their power. It fits all of the features of any selection mechanism for public office. And actually, because PSU is a public university, in a way, I do occupy a public office. Now, how did I get this job? First of all, most of your professors, not all of them, but most of them, and it still is the norm, have a PhD. They have a doctorate in the field that they're teaching. And so we can see that there's already a multi-tiered system, but maybe a different way or a better way to look at it is the eligibility criteria for holding this office is having a PhD. And what that means is that the people who are teaching your classes had to go through a certain institutional process that is going to select for some people and deselect for others. And this is an important feature of what I'm going to talk about today because we cannot separate the broader environment. I'm going to use a lot of sort of natural selection metaphor today. But we can't separate the broader environment, the competitive environment, the selection environment from office holders and from the process that is used to select those office holders. So one of the background conditions is needing to get a doctorate, and there are certain traits and dispositions and attitudes and skills that are required to do that. First of all, you have to decide that that's what you want to do. You want to spend 5+ years of your life after college getting a doctorate, and you have to have the ability to take the classes and succeed and do the research and do the writing and please your committee and do all the things that it takes. Any type of selection mechanism is going to have certain kinds of, we can call them hoops that you have to jump through, even though that's maybe a disparaging term, but there are hoops you have to jump through, and people who have the skills and dispositions to jump through those hoops, they have the ability to do it, but they also have the disposition, the desire to do it, and the disposition that enables them to use the skills in an applicable way. And as a person who's gotten a PhD, and it's been many, many years now, but for sure, there are certain skills and dispositions that are absolutely essential for getting a doctorate. Now, it doesn't mean that lots of people can't have these, but any time there are hoops to jump through, that's going to essentially cull the herd. It's going to thin the ranks of the people who can make it through that hoop. And selection mechanisms have that feature. That's basically what selection mechanisms are, is they are filters. And the more filters there are, the more people are going to get filtered out. And the more specific the features of the filters are, the more narrowly it's going to create a channel for certain kinds of people to get through. So it's not just that we have these selection mechanisms and people have to go through them. The selection mechanisms themselves operate as filters. Now, not to stray too far from my introductory metaphor here about, or example of getting to be your professor, I had to then get a doctorate, and then I had to get hired. I had to be able to get my application to the attention of the hiring committee, which is made up of people appointed from the political science department. So basically the people who do the hiring initially, and they have to have their decision approved by higher ups, but they really have a lot of discretion, are people who hold this position and themselves had to get doctorates and had to go through this process themselves and get tenure. You don't have to have tenure to get a job. Obviously, you're looking for a tenure-track job, but most hiring committees are going to be chaired for sure and often just made up of the tenured faculty in the department. Non-tenured faculty typically don't have as much of a role, or if you're in a non-tenured position, like I actually am, you're not going to be on hiring committees. So I don't need to get into too much of the arcana of this. It's just an introductory example, and I don't want to take up an hour with it, and I promise that I won't. But the point is this, is that the people who are eligible and who are able to get into the applicant pool and get to the hiring committee, the interview, the teaching demonstration, the meetings, all the stuff that goes into getting hired at a major university like PSU, those people first had to display a certain set of skills and dispositions to get a doctorate in the first place. And then they have to be noticed by people who themselves have done the same thing and who are in a position essentially to be choosing their own colleagues. Then you have to be the winner of that process. Now, for the purposes of this lecture, there are, in any selection process, multiple people could, in theory, be the winner, even though there's only one winner. But what a selection process does, whatever the steps are, whatever the hoops, whatever the eligibility requirements, whatever the people making the decisions along the way, their nature and the nature of their expectations are going to narrow the type of people who can become winners to a smaller and smaller group that will tend to have a similar set of traits or characteristics. And that similar set of traits or characteristics will be the ones that have been required at each stage of this process. Now, the interesting thing about any particular kind of selection process is that ultimately the goal is to fill an office or fill a position. And that position itself has desirable characteristics, it has desirable traits of the person who's going to occupy that office. And we can look at that office from the position of, okay, what do we want the people who hold it to be like? And one selection process construction could be to work backwards and say, okay, here's what we want. How do we set up a selection process to get those people? But that's not the way it often happens or always happens, and that's definitely not the way it happens when designing a political system. What happens is, what selection mechanism do we have available to us? Do we like, do the people who are making the decisions and the foundational decisions, what do they want it to be like? And then the office holders are essentially, instead of being well suited and designed to have the traits we want, typically what they have is they have the traits that helped get them through the selection mechanism in the first place. So for the professor example, I know I was in school for a long time, so I had this experience, and I know that all of you have had this experience as well. You've had some amazing professors who are great teachers, and you've had some amazing professors who are great researchers, but terrible teachers or mediocre teachers. And then you've had professors who really aren't good teachers at all, aren't even necessarily interested in teaching. And this is an interesting disjunction between the job and the selection mechanism that gets people into that job. And it's often very frustrating to students, college students, who are just like, but I'm paying for top quality instruction, and why am I getting some people who, while they might be top quality researchers or top quality advocates or whatever they happens to be, big name practitioners, they're not very good teachers. It seems like the job is to be a teacher. And I myself have had that frustration with some of my professors. I've also had some excellent professors. The question being, why aren't all of your college professors at least good teachers, if not excellent teachers? And the answer is, the selection process is not oriented towards selecting for or finding teachers. Getting a PhD is about learning how to research and how to please people who are sort of the guardians of the field that you are getting your PhD in. Getting the job, once you have the PhD, is about connecting with people who see you as a future colleague, and the characteristics that they're looking for in a future colleague are partly good teachers, but not necessarily mainly. That's not because the hiring committees are bad people. It's because the hiring committees themselves have gotten to that position through a series of filters, and they aren't necessarily always oriented towards. Their concern is not necessarily to be like, oh, who are the best teachers that are available? Their concern is, who are the biggest names in the field? What does your resume look like? What kind of stuff have you published? How are you going to enhance the prestige of our institution that I'm already a part of? All of those, I can sound like that's disparaging. It's not. All of those make perfect sense from the point of view of the people who are the guardians of the selection process. What it doesn't necessarily do is connect the selection process as a filter with the final goal. So now, the reason why this is relevant, and I think that you can probably tell, is that in a democratic system, we have a variety of different selection processes, and sometimes those processes, I would say often those processes, are not necessarily put together in order to assure that we get the kinds of office holders who have the necessary characteristics, because what the job requires is a different set of skills from what the selection process selects for. It's, sometimes people will have two big sets of skills. They'll have the skills that are needed to get through the selection process, and then they'll have the set of skills that the job requires. But that is often a lot to ask, right? So to become an elected official, to get, say, to be a state senator, you have to be able to appeal to voters. And before that even, you have to be able to connect with party leaders, you have to be able to connect with fundraisers, you have to be able to connect with people who are willing to finance your campaign, work for your campaign, endorse you. There's the traits and characteristics that are necessary to get elected are not necessarily those that are necessary for being a good policymaker, for being able to write good bills, evaluate bills that are submitted to you, compromise with your fellow legislators, work on sort of getting to the best option that's possible that can get a large enough consensus to get through the legislative process. That is a very big set of skills that some people have both. Some people have the ability to connect with party leaders, connect with financiers, connect with people who are willing to volunteer for their campaign and do that. But what it takes to become a legislator is not demonstrating the skill of what the legislator does. This is probably not that radical of an idea that the so-called interview process, and I air quote that because that's not my term, but I've heard many people use it, the interview process for becoming an elected official, which is winning an election, is not geared towards finding out whether or not that job can be well done. And part of that is the needs of being being a candidate, right? The skills that you have to even get on the ballot are not necessarily policy-making skills. And then part of that is laid at the feet of the people who, if you're going to look at elected officials and not say, well, how well are you going to be able to do the job? But you're looking at them saying, do you stand for the things I like? Are you a person that's trustworthy to me as a person? Are you good looking? Are you charismatic? Can you move me emotionally? These are the things that typically motivate people to vote for somebody. Not, does this person seem like they have a grasp of the policy-making process and the requisite diplomatic skills to work with other legislators to make rational, sane, effective policy that's going to pragmatically solve the problems that we face as a people? So there's a cultural aspect to a disjunction between a selection mechanism and the role that the selection mechanism is seeking to fill, because if the selectors, in this case for elections, the voters, aren't looking at the traits that would would make a person succeed in that job, then we're not going to get people who are selected for that. But before the voters even get to make a choice, there's a set of selection mechanisms that channel certain kinds of people into the ability to even get on the ballot in the first place. And those skills, while they are very important skills, right? The ability to connect with party leaders, to connect with people who are going to finance your campaign, to connect with people who are going to donate their time to running your campaign and doing the groundwork and all the groundwork that's involved in getting elected, the ability to then present yourself to the people in a way that is inspiring to them. Those are high-level skills, and I'm not saying, I definitely don't want to denigrate those skills. Those are high-level skills, and the people who possess them will succeed in the campaign field. They're just not necessarily the same skills that are going to get you to do the job well. Now, I want to talk as systematically as I can for the sort of remaining time of this lecture about what assumptions I'm making and what kinds of dynamics I'm talking about. And I'm going to just read from my notes, which are the typed notes. There are two big assumptions that I make when I talk about the connection between the selection mechanism and governance. One is the assumption of strategic behavior, and the other one is the assumption of natural selection. And the assumption of strategic behavior, I won't read the notes directly, you can read them for yourself, but the assumption is basically that if in order to win a position, you have to behave strategically with regard to the selection process. So, for example, if you want to be a state legislator, if you want to be an elected official, you have to behave in a way that will maximize your chances of succeeding within that selection mechanism. So you have to do the things that it takes to win. Otherwise, even if you would be a great legislator, a great policymaker, a great sort of legislative diplomat, a pragmatic problem solver, even if you display all those skills, you can't say, I have these skills, pick me. You have to strategically behave in a way that will get you through the selection process before you can get the job. Now, you also are then likely to, because this is the way human beings are, you're likely to continue the kind of behavior that has made you successful once you win office. Mostly because that's what makes you successful. You're like, this is what I'm good at, and you're validating your skills and abilities and your dispositions and saying, well, I'm a successful candidate, so I'm going to behave that same way in office. Also, it's because it's often very difficult to have two completely separate high-level skills, right? One of the reasons why we almost never get a president with military command experience, even though one of the most important jobs of the President of the United States is Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, is that the skills that it takes to prosper in the chain of command and climb the chain of command and stay in the military and become a top military commander with the experience that would give you the ability to be a really, really good Commander-in-Chief are far from the skills that are required to succeed as a campaigner, a candidate in the political world where it's not a hierarchical pyramid of chain of command. There's a lot different skills, more diplomacy, and more sort of personal interaction that is less certain and more subjective. There's reading of people. It's possible that you could be a person who rises through the military chain of command and also possesses the kinds of interpersonal and media skills that will enable you to win the presidency. But that's asking a lot from anybody to have two big high-order sets of skills like that. And so that's one of the reasons why we often get presidents, almost always, who don't have either the experience or the disposition to both win a campaign and be an effective commander-in-chief. And that is true for an awful lot of positions in government, that the things that allow you to be successful at getting the position aren't necessarily coupled with the skills that would make you successful at doing that job, and there's a certain crowding out aspect of it. If you spend a lot of time in your life developing and cultivating and nurturing certain skills, you just don't really have the time to also then nurture and develop another set of skills. If you're learning how to be a good military commander, if you're learning how to navigate the chain of command, if you're learning how to be a strategic military thinker, as well as a leader of people in that environment, you really don't have a whole lot of space left in your life to learn also how to be a good politician, how to be a good campaigner, how to be charismatic, and how to connect with voters emotionally. Because you're not learning those skills by cultivating all the other skills, and there's only 24 hours in the day, and so it's asking an awful lot. So the assumption of strategic behavior, it not only assumes that people are going to use the skills that win them the office, and if they don't, they're not going to get it, right? If you choose to break this assumption and say, well, you know what, I'm going to behave as though I'm the person who can do the job, ignoring the selection mechanism, you're not going to win. If you get out there and try to connect with voters by presenting your skills that will make you good at doing the job, you might win, but you're probably not going to. And you're probably not even going to get into the race in the first place because you haven't done all the connecting with party leaders, with financiers, with activists who will donate their time to your campaign. You can't just skip ahead and say, I'm good at the job, pick me, right? You have to do the stuff. And that's the interesting thing about, say, to connect back with my introductory example about being a professor. You can't just be like, I'm an amazing teacher. I know my subject inside out. I know how to connect with students. I know how to write good paper topics. I know how to construct a really interesting class. Hire me. Well, okay, do you have a PhD? Do you have research that shows that you're going to bring prestige to the university? No, so you're not going to get that job. And maybe you will, but you're probably not going to. The other assumption is the assumption of natural selection, and that is that in any in any selection process, the strategic propensity, the skills and dispositions that are needed to get through that process as a winner are going to be selected. So we're going to get office holders who fit the criteria not of the job, but of the selection process. And of course, from the point of view of democratic theory, the goal is to try to align those two things, is to try to have the selection mechanism be aligned with the characteristics we want in the job. And in certain kinds of offices, that can be done more successfully than in others. One of the limitations of seeing democracy through the lens of voting only, or primarily through the lens of voting, is that voting processes aren't necessarily going to select for office holders who have the characteristics that the job requires. Whatever kind of selection mechanism we have to choose the President of the United States, as long as that is going to involve votes by Americans, no matter what that process is, it's going to select for people who are capable of connecting with voters and who are capable of doing all the other work in advance of that to get on the ballot in the first place, to win the nomination, to be able to raise enough money. Whatever those skills are, and that's tremendously difficult. And this is one of the things that I've often said about Donald Trump is he did a really, really hard thing. He won the presidential election, and that demonstrates a high level of skill in one particular domain, and we shouldn't run that down. That is a tremendous accomplishment for anybody. He's probably the best example, though I think most presidents are really good examples of this, that having the skills needed to make it through the selection process successfully doesn't give you, and probably takes you farther away from having the skills to actually do the job. So Donald Trump is, I would say, maybe the best example, but by far not the only example of the disparity between a selection mechanism and the capability to do the job effectively. In any voting system, though, it's going to be very difficult to make sure that the selection process chooses for people who have the right characteristics, because campaigning, winning an election, is itself such a difficult, high-level, and competitive endeavor that the people who are good at that won't necessarily have had time to cultivate the skills to do the job. And just with the example of military service, to get to be President of the United States, you really haven't had the time to live one life and get that military command experience, and live another life and get the political experience, and live a third life and get the managerial experience that are needed to do that job. We just only have one life to live, in 24 hours in a day, and so many days in our lives. So when you rely on voting, there's going to be a difficulty of actually aligning the selection mechanism with the requirements of the job, because most positions, elected positions, the skills to do that job are not the same as the skills to get that job. Now, they're not completely divorced from each other either, right? The ability to make connections with party leaders, the ability to convince people to finance your campaign, etc., the ability to reach out and connect with voters emotionally and viscerally, those are useful for working with other legislators. Those are useful for being involved in a cooperative endeavor, which is what policymaking and legislating is. But they are not necessarily the skills that would allow you to, one, make good policy decisions, to become a policy expert in the areas that you're going to be becoming a policy expert in, or even to be necessarily a good manager of a staff that is going to be doing that for you, right? You've had to acquire certain management skills to be a candidate, absolutely, but it isn't necessarily the same as managing a professional staff of expert policymakers. You've been managing a professional staff of expert campaign people. Different kind of managerial task. And again, not totally divorced from each other, but not extraordinarily well aligned either. And of course, also in any electoral system, in any selection mechanism, but particularly in an electoral system, if you want to keep getting that job, if you want to keep getting rehired by the people, reelected, you have to be consistently in campaign mode. So there really is just also a sense in which there's a crowding out effect here, that even if you have the skills to be an effective policymaker and an effective manager of a sort of team of policy experts, you still can't dedicate all of your time to doing that job. You have to be dedicating your time to getting rehired, right? Imagine if you had to spend 10 of your 40 working hours working on your resume and talking to recruiters just to keep the job that you already have, not even to get a new job, but just to keep the job that you already have, and you had to spend another 10 hours raising money to keep your position alive so that you could keep getting paid, you wouldn't be able to do your job as effectively, even if you were good at the job. If you're dividing your time and energy between keeping your job or getting your job again and doing the job, there's simply going to be a mismatch there. And that's actually one of the reasons why elections are not the only way that we fill offices. It would be very inefficient and highly ineffective to fill every position in a government with people who had to get elected periodically. That's why we use appointment, and that's why we use hiring, professional hiring, civil service hiring, and that's why in some cases there's sortition as well. Now, the thing to note is that one of the driving forces behind political reform efforts is this misalignment between selection mechanisms and the capacities and capabilities and dispositions and traits that we want in office holders. When that becomes noticeable and problematic, when we see in our system that the people who are winning in these selection mechanisms are not capable of doing the job very well, then there is momentum and energy and desire to change the selection mechanism. And in fact, that's what's behind a lot of political reform movements. And this is where democratic theory kicks in, which is a way of saying, okay, here are the other available selection mechanisms, and let's look at these for the kinds of dynamics that they're going to create and the kind of traits and capabilities that people are going to need to succeed in this different environment, this new selection mechanism, this new landscape of competition and survival, and try to align that more closely with the type of capabilities, skills, dispositions that we want those office holders to have. It is a tricky thing. I mean, even just simply, if you have total control, if you're the hiring manager for a company and you know you want to hire people to fill certain positions, to do certain jobs, and you absolutely want the best people who are most capable of doing that job, even there, when one person has total control over a hiring system, it can be difficult to know, like, well, okay, should we do an interview? Should we take them out to dinner to see what their skills are like? Should we give them logic puzzles? Should we run them to make them do simulations? What would be the best way to filter out the people who are less likely to do well at this job? And in a democratic system, it's even more challenging because there are already pre-existing systems for selecting them, so to reform them you have to transform a system that already exists, and two, the options that are available to you as a democratic theorist, as a political reformer in a democracy, are more limited. We can't just say, okay, you know what, to do the job of president we need to have a hiring committee who is working from a set of candidates who apply and winning them down. We can't do that. We can't, we could in theory, but it seems highly undemocratic, and it's politically impossible and infeasible to put into place a hiring procedure for the presidency that would get us presidents who actually have the skills. We would, for the most part, we would probably end up with people who are CEOs or successful military commanders or drawn from some part of the world where you've learned how to do all this. And even then still, there would be traits that would be unselected for, because the presidency is a big and I think a big and essentially undoable job for a single person. Now, that also then brings up the issue, and this is where it gets back to like designing and selecting office holders, which is when you choose what offices to create and what powers and responsibilities and limitations to put in a particular office, you can at that point also be looking, okay, are we creating a doable job? Are we creating a position that requires a set of skills that we can expect one person to have, and that we can expect a selection mechanism that's available to us to select for? And that's one of the reasons why there are a lot of countries that use a multiple executive, and a lot of states that use a multiple executive instead of a unified executive, is because the job of chief executive of the executive branch, especially when you couple it with commander-in-chief, is going to be undoable by one person, and so divide that job among different people. And then there'll still be the difficulty of aligning an electoral process with a governance position. And I'm going to conclude by noting that's one of the difficulties of democratic theory and of establishing a democratic system, is that it's practically impossible to align the selection mechanism with the capabilities we want in the position, to align them fully, right? What we can do is we can try to align them more fully, but there's always going to be a loss. And this is one of the trade-offs in giving people the power to select those who govern them and who make policy and who run the day-to-day operations of the government, is that there needs to be some level of popular control over that, and that's going to create a limited set of selection mechanisms that are available that won't necessarily be fully aligned. Doesn't mean it's impossible to do a better job of it. It just means that there are a set of trade-offs that are involved here. Okay, well, that is the last lecture in Module 1. In Module 2, we're going to move on to a similar set of issues with a different orientation, which is we're going to look at institutions and arrangements. How do we set up offices? How do we distribute them among institutions? And how do we connect those institutions with each other so that we can ensure effectiveness, efficiency, checks on power, a responsible division of authority and discretion? That's a big set of questions, and we'll get to that in the next module.